the first 100 miles of the narrow gauge Carson and Colorado Railroad from Mound House down to Hawthorne. I'm seeing maybe in the future we have a team up between Maryland and Lawrence, and we can really get the entire thing down to the inch detail in every single viaduct and tunnel and all details. Oh, come on. That's the only thing I could find for Maryland, to talk about Maryland and our culverts. But anyway, on to Lawrence.
Thank you, sir. So, the first thing you folks are probably thinking is, what are you going to do different that Maryland already did? Is this going to be a duplication? And no, it's not going to be. In fact, a lot of you folks have seen my style of presentation in the past, and you know it's fairly distinct, and I'm going to continue with that. And what I promise to do is to take you to places that nobody else will go, or has been. Wendell recently called me a bushwhacker. So that's what I'm going to do. We're going to essentially operate as a local train, which means we're going to stop at every siding. It's not an express route. And we're going to check out essentially the first 100 miles of the C&C and the NNC and the SP narrow gauge starting in Mound House. So using the same map that Maryland used yesterday, I think this is the only duplication in our presentation. We're going to start at Mound House and head down south, and I just noticed yesterday that this map apparently is not to scale. It doesn't look like it. But we're gonna go this 100 miles down through Wabusca, along Walker Lake, and stop at Hawthorne, which is the beginning of my presentation last year for Hawthorne down to Benton. So starting at Mound House, milepost 0.0, and this gives me a good opportunity to talk about mileposts. Maryland said yesterday that there were 2 sets of mileposts on this, and I'd like to revise that and say that there were 3 sets along the entire railroad and 4 sets along a part of it. We have the original Carson and Colorado mileposts that started at Mound House with 0. Then when the NNC took over, they resurveyed it, and milepost 0 was at Hazen. When the SP took over, they put new mileposts entirely on it, and now for the section from Thorne to Wabusca, the Army has come in and put in their own series of mileposts. So we've actually got 4 sets over a part of the alignment for the original Carson and Colorado. So I'm going to use the Carson, Colorado mileposts, and most of the maps are actually going to be NNC, since they have a very nice series of detail. So at Mound House, and I do clarify, I'm not a Mound House expert. I believe we have several of those here, so I did my best to include it and bring myself up to date on all the research that has gone up to right now. At Mound House, the C&C had a joint station, a freight house, an engine house, a yard, and a main line that exited to the southeast, that is, in this direction. Under NNC days, Nevada and California, they still had the depot and the freight house, the engine house, miscellaneous buildings, but they changed the alignment so that it exited towards the northeast in this fashion. And the SP kept that alignment, although they did add at least 1 spur track for industry. So here we are, we're looking north. The highway, the present highway, is right about down in this vicinity. And here's on a USGS map, which I'll include in the corner of each of these NNC maps for comparison. This is that section of the map. NNC maps are all about 1906. And they predate the SP val maps by about 10 years. So this is that SP map. Again, Mound House, milepost 0 on the C&C, and here is that new spur that shows up in SP years going to one of the local industries. So we're going to just keep marching along to every spur and siding and any other interesting point that I thought we could talk about as we head eastward and then south. A couple of photos. The very popular view. I just changed the date of this again this morning based on Stephen's research from 1910 back to 1905. Very popular view, and then a current view in the general vicinity along modern Highway 50. So heading east, we come to Spring Valley. Spring Valley was what C&C referred to as their first good water. They had a water tank here, and that water tank was right here where the spring still is. This is a view of what it looks like heading southeast. The C&C is curving around right here towards the mountains south of Dayton. Mound House is over here, and the tracks have come over here, crossed the highway to Virginia City, and have come up here and curved around and heading over to Dayton. So the spring is still there, the trees are still there. It's still a rather pretty spot, but it disappeared by the time the NNC and the SP came around. They didn't have any facilities there at all. Moving right along, we come to a spot called Goldie, milepost 3.8, my calculations. This is what it looks like, looking west. Now Goldie doesn't show up on the C&C records or SP or NNC, so I included it because Mr. Myrick did in his book, and he said it was a spot, so I'll keep it there until we disprove that or figure out that there's really nothing there interesting. But it is kind of a nice picturesque place, and there are folks living there now, so it may have been a historic community as well. The C&C is coming along right down the canyon here, out towards Dayton. And there is Dayton. Very important stop in the early days. This is an NNC map. North is off to that direction. You can see the facilities here, the yard, the current location with Dayton, and Keeler off here towards the east and to the south. A lot of detail here. They had a lot going on at Dayton. Here's the bridge across the Carson River. 6 miles from Mound House. Another map, this is the SP version. You can still see it was an important place. A yard, sidings, the river crossing. The C&C had a 1879 station here that was at Mound House, a water tank, spurs to the mills that were both to the east and the west. The NNC had 2 sidings, about 900 feet long each, and the SP's facilities were similar to the NNC. So here's a map I put together of Dayton. This is a current Google map. I put the alignment, the main line coming through Dayton and on across the river and to the east. They had a spur to the Rock Point Mill right here, and I included this because I haven't fully resolved this yet, how they got there. I've seen it hand-drawn on maps both ways, either following the river, staying on the same side of the river, or crossing over, although this scenario doesn't make as much sense because then they would have to put in another bridge across the Carson River. So my bet is that they stayed on the same side of the river, but since I haven't seen an official railroad map with that part of the alignment on it, I'll keep both of them on there for now.
Where's the depot?
Depot is, or was, right here.
This is the one that burned down, right?
Yes. Yes, it was right here, about in this vicinity, and the preservation group moved it up to right about, I believe it's on this corner right here. Or was right there. Okay, this is a view of Dayton. The photo quality of the 1894 view is not quite as good as I'd like, but I like the picture so much that I keep it in there as a placeholder. It's a can photo from Virginia City that really shows there's a station right there, one of the mills, the historic parts of the town, and then the main line crossing over the river and heading off into the distance. So I'm looking for a better version of this to match the 2011 view that I took right here of the same location. But Ken actually took a series of views. There's at least two, I believe 3, that he took from this hillside showing the various facilities there at Dayton.
There is a mill in that photo to the left?
To the left?
Where the spur went in along the highway, or do you think?
I believe this was a mill right here, but I'm not quite sure if there are any others showing up in the photo.
Yeah, the previous slide you were talking about a mill, the SP had a spur.
It's further to the left. That's right.
There were several other mills, at least one mill further south.
Okay.
The mill in the
along the west side of the railroad at that location.
Okay.
That show up in some of the other photos.
The one in that photo is the birdsong.
Is it?
Yeah.
Dayton had a lot of interesting mills, and that would actually make the subject of a presentation all by itself.
Microphone.
Dayton actually had a lot of mills, and as I said, that would make a good presentation all by itself for someone to focus on the mills there and the railroad and how they changed over time. So we're heading eastward. Here's Randall, milepost 8. Most of these sidings that will come to between here and Wabusca were all of the NNC vintage. They didn't exist in the CNC days, and they disappeared often when the SP fully integrated it. So I'm assuming that they were essentially just places where the NNC could put cars out of the way or pass trains due to the traffic coming from Tonopah. They lasted a short period, but fortunately we have the maps to show where they were and what might be left over out there today. So Randall was the first heading out of Dayton, 2 miles east of Dayton. Here it is. It's essentially right at the outskirts of the subdivisions at Dayton. They're marching subdivisions out in that direction. You can see that they had a 324-foot spur right there during the NNC days, and it did last to the SP as well. So here's what it looks like right now. The subdivisions have stopped right about there. I was out there last year, and this is a picture looking back towards Dayton itself. Another 4 miles, we come to Canty. Canty is very close to the Carson River Canyon where it narrows up. Right here at this location, just beyond the last of the subdivisions in Dayton. Here is the siding itself. There's nothing under the CNC. And under the NNC and SP, there was about a 400-foot spur right at this location. You can see the Carson River coming in and getting very close to the alignment. And then here's what it looks like last year. We're standing at that spur location, and the track is heading up into the canyon. I might mention this part of the CNC we're going to go through here, between here and Fort Churchill, or Churchill, is very difficult to access. There's 3 or 4 different private property owners. It's all fenced off. There's a fence about every 2 miles or so. So most people just really aren't familiar with it or what it looks like or what's in there. So going further east, we have a place called Spur A. It was just there at NNC days, about 200 feet long on the south side. It shows up here along the south side of the Carson River on the Misfits Flats topo map. And here's what it looks like now. We're looking west. We're in the narrows of the canyon. We're looking west, and if you look real carefully here, you can actually see Virginia City up on the side of the mountain. 15 miles from Mound House. Now Clifton was a stop along the CNC. It's one of it's the oldest railroad settlement along this stretch. They did have a stop. I don't have details of what they had there during CNC days, other than they had a section house and a tool house. During the NNC days, they also had a water tank, an 865-foot spur, but all of that had disappeared by the time SP took over. We're right in the Carson River Narrows here. Here's where we are. It still shows up on the USGS map. And there's some interesting things going on out there. I was there in '97 and went out there again last year. This is what it looks like. This is looking east as it heads into the narrowest part of the canyon. And look at what they have out there. They actually have what appears to be a freight car. That was out there. There were actually several cars in '97 when I was out there. I don't have photos from that trip. But the owner of the land or someone has built an enclosure to protect it, or at least partially protect it from the weather. So I don't know the history of the car, but it sure would be an interesting topic and a curiosity why the owner would spend that kind of money to go ahead and protect it. So I'm calling it a car shelter, and in the same slide I'm showing you my transport to get out there. This is my M-bike, my counterpart of the e-bike, M being manual. So not only was it my M-bike on this trip, but with a fence every 2 miles and going out about 12 or 13 miles, I literally had to lift this over or under or around 12 barbed wire fences. And I was pretty hacked up by the time I got back. But I did make it pretty much the entire distance. And this has become my, my route, my mode of choice now on difficult sections.
You didn't get shot at, did you?
I did not get shot. In fact, in that visit, I didn't see a single person out there. It's that remote. Moving further east, 20 miles from Mound House, we come to Lyon. And they did not have facilities there in CNC. They had a 250-foot spur during the NNC days, but also it had disappeared by the time SP took over. It's right here on the USGS map, and there is the spur track, or was the spur track in 1906. And I don't have a photo for Lyon yet. I was there in '97, but I did not get a photo of it. I did get one of a place that I often mispronounce. I believe they would pronounce it Tugela, 21 miles from Mound House. Look how close the river is to the railroad. It's actually in the right-of-way. And I can imagine during flood times of the year, this was quite a maintenance challenge for all three railroads, CNC, NNC, and SP. So they did have a 225-foot spur right there just during NNC days. And here is where it shows up along the right-of-way. There's a development, there's quite a development across the river here, starting here, where they do automotive research. They have a test track there, and I think they're actually testing various facets of auto maneuvering. And they own this property. So here is what Tugela looks like. I was just out there in the spring. This is looking towards the west. And I'm fairly certain that the little settlement was right here at this, this cottonwood tree, which is likely where they had a well. So that is the remote part. That's the part that I accessed by my M-bike. Again, I don't know of any historic photographs out there, not even of Clifton. It's that remote. It's just people in the old days and in modern days just don't go out there, in part because of the inaccessibility issues. So Churchill, though, is easy to get to. I've been out to Churchill many times. I'm showing you here a 1906 NNC map of Churchill. where north is to the left, you can see that they had a small yard here with spurs and sidings. There's two maps I'm going to show you. Again, north is to the right. This is the southernmost, the northernmost. Carson River is right here, and the C&C is coming along this road right here and coming down here, and this is where the Y was for a while both lines were in. This is the new N&C main line up to Hazen. So at Churchill, 28 miles from Mound House, during C&C days, they had a depot. During N&C days, they had a depot, a yard, a Y, a coal trestle. SP days, the depot, yard, Y, an agent's house, and the oil tank had replaced a coal trestle by then. So here's the depot, coal trestle, N&C map. Here is the northernmost part of that map. You can see the Y that was in location right here. This is to Mound House, to Hazen. And this is what it looks like, essentially standing right here and looking out into the Y. This is what it looked like this spring. And then here's that lower part. Here's the essentially the station, which was right here. This was the coal trestle at the N&C days and the other facilities that they had at that point. It's kind of an interesting location and not that difficult to get to these days. This is what it looked like in the 1910s. Interesting, very clear photograph. For some reason, the gentleman did not want to look at the camera, so he's looking the other way. And then this is what it looked like in 2009, which looks very similar to the way it does today as well. So moving right along, 30 miles from Mound House, we come to Washout. Washout was a stop and had a section house there under the C&C. They also had a water tank during N&C days, but all of that had disappeared by the time that SP fully took over. So here is Washout on the USGS map. And then here's what Washout looked like earlier this spring, looking south towards the location that they had the facilities, and then this very distinctive rock formation here on the east side of the railroad. And Shiny Rail, this is on the part of the line that's still owned by UP. UP owns and operates from Hazen to Wabasca, and then the Army takes over and runs the rest of the line from Wabasca down to Thorne and into Hawthorne on the military trackage there amongst all the bunkers. So the last stop before we get to Wabasca then is New Manna, 37 miles from Mound House. Here it is on the USGS map. It shows up first on the N&C, where they had two different spur tracks, right here and right here. This is an interesting one going to the edge of the right-of-way. And again, this had all disappeared by the time SP took over 10 years later. And then here is what it looks like, or it looked like in 2015, looking northwest up into the canyon, the Churchill River Canyon. Sorry, was there a question?
Is that the highway on the left of the photo?
It's not the highway, but it is one of the county roads that leads up into, you can drive between here and all the way up to Churchill.
Talk closer to the mic.
Can you eat the mic so we can hear?
How's this?
Good. Yeah, as long as you keep it up there. Thank you.
So here's Wabasca, milepost 40, even milepost 40 from Mound House. Here is the Y that went to connect with the Nevada Copper Belt. can see that the NNC had a yard, small yard, station and other facilities there. This was the largest town between Dayton and Hawthorne. Here is the same location on the USGS map. So the facilities there, we had a station, 1875 station from Huffaker's, an agent's house, a spur and a siding, all in the NNC days, in the CNC days. We had a 1907 station in the NNC days, a freight house, a water tank, a yard, and a Y. And then we still had the depot, a freight house, a water tank, a yard, and believe it or not, something I'd never seen before, especially on a short line, is a double Y during the SP days. So here is the store and hotel, which still is there. The station, or the depot, was there before we moved it to here to Carson City. Here is the one half of the Y. Current modern highway going right through the middle of all this. And then, believe it or not, this is the SP Nevada Copper Belt double Y. This would be the part heading along the Nevada Copper Belt main line, and then this would be a Y accessing the smelter up at Thompson. I'm not 100% sure that this part was ever built, but it does show up on the SP maps. And it's very, very unusual for a short line, at least from my experience. This is a SP map from about 1916. And interestingly, it's marked on the map, not owned by CPRY Company or SP. So here is a very nice view of Wabusca in the 1880s, looking east on the CNC. This is the hotel right there, and it's still there, or was there in 2009. I believe it is still there.
Yeah, it's still there.
Same location. Very nice, clear 1880s view. Penrose. Now, we begin another section of the CNC that's not that accessible. It's more accessible than the Churchill River Canyon and the Carson River, but there just are not a lot of people out there. So we're heading east. We're going to make a big loop and then a turn. We're going to head east out towards Weber Reservoir and then turn south down, go down through Shores and into along Walker Lake to Thorne and Hawthorne. Penrose is the first place we come to, milepost 42. Penrose is right on the outskirts of Wabusca. Wabusca's up here. It shows up in the NNC maps as a spur track, an abandoned spur track to the old dump, which didn't exist on the CNC, and then it also disappears before it reached the SP maps. Cleaver was next, 43 miles. And Cleaver was the location of a crossing for the Walker River, the next river heading south. And the Walker River will be now alongside the CNC all the way down to Walker Lake. Here is the location, USGS. Cleaver was right on the west side of the tracks here. They had a 15-minute schedule stop along the CNC, a turntable section house. On the NNC, they had a section house, a car house, a bunk house, and another spur track labeled as Old Dump. So I suspect there may have even been a Y down here at one point, going to a fairly significant location for them. And then right across the tracks on the other side of the bridge, for some reason, they had another settlement here called Lux, milepost 44. Both existed during NNC days. The NNC had a 300-foot spur there that the SP maintained at least for 10 years after that. Here's the Walker River. Cleaver was right here. Lux is right there.
I think Lux is named for the Miller and Lux ranchers, butchers, the industrial cowboys, you know.
But that could very well be, Brian. And that would make sense given this area. So here's a picture of here's a picture of Cleaver looking east. There's the Walker River Bridge right there. And here's a picture of Lux looking west towards the mountains there by on the other side of Wabasca. So moving further east, 47 miles from Mound House, we come to Mason, or later called Moquist by Southern Pacific. No facilities under the CNC, but there was under both NNC and SP 1,700-foot siding. So when I move the mic away from my mouth, that's a test to see if you guys are really asleep or not. And I know the ones that are paying attention can't hear me, so they'll say, move the mic closer.
Or we're just being told.
Here's the notation to Mason on the NNC map. So it was essentially a CNC facility where they called it Mason. And then here's the current view of what that looks like. This is a spur track that the Army still uses in this view looking west back towards Wabasca. Rio Vista, 55 miles. This became an interesting place because of a photograph that Stephen published recently. But it was a place during CNC days. They had a section house, a tool house, and about 1,000-foot spur track. Under the NNC, it became an 1,800-foot long siding, and they also had the section house and the tool house. Here it is, right here through this curve. Here's where it is, according to USGS. You can see Weaver Reservoir over here to the east. Here is that photograph that Stephen published showing the siding there at Rio Vista. And then here's a photo I took in 2010. This location would have been just a little bit further in the distance here where the curve is going to the left. But you can see that the mountains match up very well in the distance, which makes it pretty clear that's where the photographer was back about 1900. Reservation was the next stop, 60 miles. This moves very quickly. So here's Reservation. I can go through 3 or 4 clicks and almost finish the presentation. So 60 miles from Mound House. This is where we are on the map. Keeler to this direction. Essentially, it was a 2,000-foot siding and a 270-foot spur track during both NNC and SP days. And this is what it looked like back in 2009, looking south down towards, you can just make out Walker Lake down there in the distance. Reservation comes from the fact that it's crossing through the Walker River Indian Reservation. Schurz, place most of you are familiar with, milepost 66. Fairly busy place under all 3 railroads. The CNC had a station, section house, a spur track. They had more there under the NNC with a freight house, a water tank, a telegraph office, and a small yard. And the SP also kept the depot there, freight house, section house, and yard. Here is Schurz. The facilities were just to the south of what the main community is there for the Indian Reservation. And here it is on the NNC map. Fairly busy map. Here's the Walker River again coming through, and the railroad facilities were here just to the north and west of that.
Comment?
Yes?
I was told by a UP train master in Sparks that today, since they run across the reservation, when they run a train down there, they have to give the Indians 24 hours notice.
There was actually a lawsuit. About 20 years ago, there was a lawsuit where the Indians on the reservation filed that the CNC and the SP had never fully prepared a proper right-of-way through the reservation. And I believe the tribe was successful in that, and they had to make a series of conciliations towards the tribe, although I'm not quite sure what they are, but that sounds logical, that it would be one of them. And of course now it would be the US Army running trains through there. Part of that also might be because those are munitions trains, and the community is logically concerned of what might happen if there was a derailment or some other sort of accident.
If the Army runs this, do they have their own equipment from Wabasca down?
Yes. Yes, they have their own locomotives. I don't recall whether or not they have their own cars, but they do have their own locomotives. And in fact, the SP narrow gauge group went on a field trip there several years ago. I believe it was in 2016, where we actually were able to ride a locomotive, an Army locomotive, out from Hawthorne out and towards Thorne for a bit. It was actually quite interesting.
Did that twice.
Or twice.
They don't use their own cars on the main line, but the Army does have their own cars that they run throughout the base
The base
itself.
there.
I got a comment.
Yes.
Mike Bayline, I was the transportation manager at Fort Bliss and Fort Carson. And yes, we had our own locomotives. At each installation I had 3 GP10s and also gen sets. The cars, DOD does have their own fleet of cars that they move around amongst the different installations to move Army units. We also rented TTX cars too, TTWX cars. But yes, many of the installations that have Army units, divisions, they do have their own rail fleet. And yes, we never did go out onto the main line. Weren't allowed to.
So thank you for adding that. On my presentation for the Hawthorne area, I do have 1 or more photographs as well of the modern Army locomotives. I believe they're painted red and yellow. So here is Schurz, a couple of photographs about a 1910 view. I thought this was on the south side of the tracks, but in reorienting it, I believe this was actually on the north side, so we're looking northeast. This building is on the south side or west side. It may be the same building that showed up there in 2010. Here's a place you don't see on many maps. I call it Rawhide Junction. It does show up on the N&C map. You can actually see right here where it's called out, and they have a notation there for the Rawhide Western Railway. For those of you folks that aren't familiar with it, it was a projected railroad that was never built, and I believe that was because Rawhide peaked before they could actually get out there and build anything to access it. But it was a mining town that was off to the east, and this would have been a logical point to connect and access. It's at this location right here. It actually still shows up as an old railroad grade. In fact, it was just a grade. They never had rail or ties that I'm aware of as we're approaching down towards Walker Lake. So here it is, no facilities on in any of the versions. They just had a turnout drawn in where they might have made a connection to the railroad.
Do you know what year that was?
The map is about 1906, which is just about right for when they projected to build the railroad. And here's what that looks like out there. Here's the Army line, the former CNC line, heading southeast down along Walker Lake, which is over here. And then here is where the Rawhide Western branch or line would have taken off into Rawhide out in this direction right here. 70 miles from Mound House.
Larry, since that was on a 1906 map, right when they were transitioning from narrow gauge to standard gauge, was the Rawhide Western slated to be narrow gauge or standard gauge?
I believe it was slated to be standard gauge.
Okay.
Standard gauge, they had bought an engine that never got up there. And
And they bought track
yeah,
materials.
the survey was done after the gauge change.
Okay.
Walker Lake, one of my favorite subjects. This is what it used to look like. 1909, actually it looked like this up until probably through the 20s. And then they started diverting its water sources, and this is what it looks like now. These maps are pretty much the same scale. So you can see that the lake used to extend all the way up to here. And the surface area is about 40%, but the volume is only about 10% of what it used to be. But you can imagine what a trip that must have been for the train crews going along here. Just this enormous lake, almost like an ocean. And nobody went out there. I have yet to find a photograph, a historic photograph, showing the railroad out along the lake. It was just that remote out there. So here's what it used to look like. Here's what it looks like right now. And we're coming down along the railroad, which is over here. There it is, which is essentially just now big sand playas heading down towards Walker Lake.
Hey Larry, I spent a night with some Boy Scouts on the edge of Walker Lake, and I can tell you why no one goes there.
It's pretty desolate out there. And the lake itself goes through its own phases. If the lake is molting, as I call it, it doesn't even smell all that good, especially on the east shore. But it is a beautiful lake. I mean, it has very vibrant blue hues that I'll show you here in some of the photographs. And it really looks like it doesn't belong there. I mean, there's no vegetation anywhere. It's just this big blue lake that got stuck out there. It's essentially it's a leftover relic of wetter eras from a time when lakes covered most of this part of Nevada. Modoc. Modoc was not a CNC town, but it was on the NNC, and they had a 2,000-foot siding, which the SP maintained, and they referred to as Stucky. So here is that location. We're heading due south here, and you can see at that time the lake was very close. Here's the siding. Keeler to the south or to the right. Here's what it looks like now. We're looking north here, and the lake would have filled this whole area over here to the west of us. Copper Hill was another NNC location. That location was right here. The lake used to fill all of this right here. In fact, there's a notation in some of the literature that here at Pelican Point was a fairly popular lakeshore camping area back in the 1870s that is no longer a popular camping area. So here we are. We're still on the Walker River Indian Reservation, by the way, and that will be the case almost till we get down to Thorne. So here's Copper Hill. Here's Copper Hill looking south. Walker Lake, you can see it's quite a ways from us right now, and the railroad is heading down south along the mountains to Hawthorne, which is right about there. All these remote sidings. Okay, Gillis was the only CNC habitation that I found along the way, or I should say facilities location. They had a section house, a bunk house, a tool house, and a spur track about 1,000 feet long during CNC days. They had similar facilities during NNC days. They lengthened the siding to 1,700 feet, and the SP kept those facilities. So here we are. This is Gillis right there. And this is Gillis today, or a short while ago. And there are still concrete ruins and relics out there of that community.
Are you still running under M power?
No. No, here I was under V power for vehicle. The ride along the east shore of Walker Lake is pretty interesting. When I first went out there in the 90s, the road was barely passable. And when the Army took over the line, they rebuilt it, and they rebuilt the access road, and it was pretty easy to drive along at that point. And I think now it's in somewhat less of disrepair, but it's pretty remote out there, and you want to make sure that your vehicle is in good condition, or take two of them.
There used to be some mining activity too, that they used that road for haul trucks to bring.
But it is pretty remote, and I don't believe there's any cell signal out there, so you're pretty much on your own. Walker stop. Again, primarily an NNC and a SP location. They called it Walker for the NNC, and then they changed it for some reason to Magnus under SP days. But here it is, right along the lake, about midway down now to Thorne. Keeler is in this direction, and you can see the lake is right up alongside of it. Essentially, the CNC, when they built through there in the 1880s, they more or less hugged the shoreline, so the lake was right up adjacent to it. And then here's what it looks like nowadays. And again, you can see the very vivid blue of the lake off there in the distance. Okay, Walker Pit. This is an interesting place. They had essentially a 90-degree turn in the alignment right there, which you can see right here. It was not a facility on the CNC. They did have a spur track right here under the NNC, 600 feet, which they lengthened to 1,000 feet under SP days. Here it is. It's a place, it's very visible. If you fly over this, you can actually see this jutting out towards the lake. So it's fairly pronounced. There was a quarry right here, which is why they had the spur track. And they actually call out on the maps 6 mile per hour maximum heading southbound. But there's more. This is what it looks like. Here's the railroad right there, making even more than a 90-degree turn. Here's what it looks like relative to the lake. The lake was right here. The Walker Lake Navigation Company actually sent boats across the lake there. The west shore, early in the century, was not very accessible. So they actually advertised access to the west shore of the lake by getting off a train here and taking a boat across to the west shore, which is now serviced by the highway. So it actually was a point of transport where you could take the train, get off the train, get on a boat, and go to essentially a resort over on the west shore of the lake close to the mountains. Sunrise, I believe, was the last community before Thorne. Right here, 91 miles from Mound House. Talking about the milepost 91, there was about from Churchill down to near Thorne, there's about a 2-mile shift between the CNC and the NNC. So they're very similar. The SP used a completely different milepost setting, as did the Army. But for the CNC and the NNC, they were very close. And I'm calling it out here to show you that here's milepost 90 and here's milepost 91 on the NNC. There's a few call-outs to the old CNC mileposts on the NNC maps. So there's no record of facilities under CNC, nor SP, but they did call it Sunrise. So I'm including it in case something interesting shows up later. And here is Sunrise. This is what it looks like. Notice all the blowing sand in the tracks here. Lake on the left looking north here back in 2009. And then another place that I'm calling Old Mainline Junction. It actually was a junction for a very short period of time before they abandoned the track down to Hawthorne. That is the old main line. But here we are. Here's the new NNC going through Thorne and cutting off and heading down south. Here's the old main line of the CNC that used to go down to Hawthorne and circle back up. That was about 5 miles longer. It's actually called the Hawthorne Cutoff on the NNC maps. And then very shortly after that, probably by about 1910 or so, they had abandoned it, and Hawthorne no longer had a railroad. So here it is, showing up on the USGS map. You can see the Army facilities over here, which are filled with bunkers and Army tracks. Keeler to this direction, Hawthorne down to the south. 94 miles from Mound House. And this is what it looks like. So I'm standing at the old junction here, and the main line would have come off down here, circled down through the bunkers, and headed down to the town of Hawthorne, right there in the distance, looking southwest back in 2009. So that is my presentation. This is what I've done for you guys. Mound House to Hawthorne this year. Back in 2017, we did Hawthorne and the Cottonwood branch. Hawthorne to Benton was 3 years ago, and then a future presentation will finish up the CNC by going from Benton to Keeler. And these are my acknowledgments.
You did the Bodie railroad too,
We did the Bodie in Benton and a number of other railroads in the same format. So thank you for all of these institutions and individuals that provided information or photographs. And hopefully we still have time for a few questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, whereabouts did SP start changing the track? When SP took over CNC, whereabouts did they start changing the track from narrow gauge to standard gauge?
It was right about the time that NNC took over. So it was right in that era of 1906, 1907.
Like physical area. Where did they start changing the track to standard gauge?
Where did they begin?
Yeah, physically, where was the track changed from narrow gauge to standard gauge?
Well, eventually they standard gauged the entire alignment from Mound House down to Tonopah Junction. The only section they did not make standard gauge was from Tonopah Junction over Mount Montgomery and then down to Keeler. That stayed narrow gauge the rest of its life. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, did they have a siding to Sutro?
Not that I'm aware of. But again, they had a lot of mills and other things going on there in the Dayton area. And I still haven't found a map yet showing the precise alignment up to the Rock Point Mill. So it's feasible they may have.
Well, they had the Dayton Central Valley Railroad too.
And they had the Dayton and Central Valley Railroad. So there was another railroad out in that area that shows up in the photographs of the Rock Point Mill. Sir?
Have you, or do you have any plans to publish anything? Like a nice book?
Have I? No, not yet. But what I'm hoping to do in the future is to develop a series of handbooks, more or less in the same style, that you guys can actually use to go out in the field and bring these with you, and actually get out there to the same locations and compare the photographs. That's one of my objectives of all of this, is to make them into a series of guidebooks if I don't run out of energy in the meantime. But for the meantime, I'll keep putting together the presentations as a precursor to that. Yes, sir?
Yeah, that area in between Dayton and Churchill in the canyon, I believe it was called the Breakahart Ranch. in the late 50s. And then Tennessee Ernie Ford, well, it used to be Brian Chucker hunting area. And then Tennessee Ernie Ford bought the breaker heart and sealed it all up.
When I first went out there in '97, there were 3 ranches there. Starting at Dayton, there was the Rolling A Ranch, then there was the Chavez Ranch, and then there was the Hodges Ranch. And I actually got permission from the Chavez Ranch to go out there in 1997, and there's been a number of changes since then. But I believe what you're saying is accurate, because I see references to that on the old maps. Most of it now is owned by the Hodges Ranch. And I was hoping by now they would have opened some of the sections for a bike trail or other access, but it's still pretty closed off out there.
Hodges is the transportation thing.
Hodges is the transportation research firm that has quite a few facilities. They have the property from about Canty, which I showed you on the map, all the way out to Churchill or near to Churchill. Other questions? Thank you very much, folks.